For context, I came across your book on the tube, Economica. I was actually on the Elizabeth line, so I don't know what that says about the marketing of the book and what line it's advertised on. And then I started listening to it, and I was so just thrilled with how, first of all, pragmatic it was, and also how informative it was, because I feel that at the moment where we are in culture, there's such like a dumpster fire of gender politics.
There is.
There's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
For sure. And whilst it's very loud, there's no, real solution or like validation. It's just about clicks and noise, which I don't think is very helpful. What the book essentially lays out is a global history of women being at the centre of economic development. And it's about taking away the gaslighting we do around that of erasing women from the pivotal roles they've played in economic development society, basically. You also are a highly respected British economist based from the University of Cambridge. You also specialise in economic history, particularly the relationship between economics and society. And you've also written 3 books, so you're a very busy woman. Those books are The Market of Growth in Early Modern Europe, The Sex Factor, which sounds a bit like X Factor, but...
Yes. Punching sex into the X Factor.
Exactly. And Naked Feminism, which is also another smart title.
Based on experience as well as research.
Oh.
So.
What a novel idea for a book. I guess to dial it back to your interest or your initial interest of economics, where did you find your personal curiosity to that subject?
Such a good question to get us started. So I was born a long time ago, 1979, which was the year Margaret Thatcher came to power. And I grew up in the north of England, in Greater Manchester, a town called Oldham. And, in the 1980s, it was in deep economic decline. But I grew up, with grandparents that told me stories of a very different time. A time when Manchester wasn't just leading Britain, but was leading the world. In the Victorian age, in the 19th century, Britain was in the midst of an industrial revolution. And that led Britain to become the richest country in the world. And Manchester's cotton factories were really at the heart of that. And so, from a young age, I was really interested in issues of economic decline, but also, what came before that, the rise before the decline, and that whole, why is it that throughout history you have countries, regions that can flourish and then go on to, end up in a ditch somewhere, to be found by an archaeologist, centuries down the line, or to be suffering economically in the way that, Oldham was when I was growing up there in the 1980s and 1990s. So it was, those kinds of thoughts that really sparked my interest in economics. And, big questions about, why are some countries rich and others poor? What causes, poverty and inequality? How do we explain rise and decline? And I saw economic history, reaching into the past, drawing on those past experiences as a way to answer those, those big questions.
So you're naturally curious.
I think so.
Yes.
Aren't we all?
Yes. Well, some people actually really don't like to look at the past as well. Some people, I don't think it's actually something that you can take personally, but they prefer to look in the future because they sometimes think, what's the point of looking at the past? But as we know from the book, there's lots of things we can glean and learn and predict for the future.
Oh, do you know, I think, in this modern day world of the manosphere, of women's rights being on a knife edge, are we going to move forward or are we going to move backwards? We're at this really, important moment in the history of women's rights. There are a lot of threats out there, and I very much believe that history can be our greatest ammunition, the ammunition that we need to stand up to modern day misogyny, to stand up to those within the manosphere that see the utopia as being a world in which, men are the providers and women retreat into the home to be the reproducers. I think history, and of course it's going to be what we're talking about today, gives us, as women, what we need to say no, to say that will not deliver the kind of prosperous and peaceful future that we all need.
I mean, we are going to get into it because you've basically just summarised the whole notes in like one succinct way. But just to kind of like dial it back, that's my favourite expression of the day, it seems like.
Dial back.
Let's just, every podcaster has an expression where it's to kind of like dial back. So let's just pause, or let's just caveat, or mine is dial it back. The thing that grabbed my attention, which I think is such a good place to start, is looking at where the birth of sexism as we know it happened. I mean, sexism has been around as long as humans have, like in the grand scheme of things, just off the top of my head, Aristotle, that's kind of
Greeks. Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, yes.
But in terms of sexism as we know it, from the book, a lot of it develops from agricultural shifts. And when we started having more abundance of wealth and resources on mass scales, and how people would use that to elevate themselves economically, vice versa, which also shows off humans' natural characteristics to be selfish, which we are. In terms of this thirst to control what we gain from society and what economically and psychologically we gain from that, why do you think that sexism developed that way from that particular instance of agricultural shifts?
So let me begin by saying that I think we are so used to thinking about when will sexism end? When will we reach this end point of, equal pay, equal representation in politics, equal access to land and resources and jobs and so on. We're so used to asking that kind of question. But actually, I think, just as interesting is the question of when did sexism begin?
Yeah.
Because actually, history isn't one long upward march from a time when things were super sexist to, onward and upwards to a time of equality. Instead, actually, going back thousands of years to the earliest human societies, they were much more equal places than we might at first imagine. So you think, before, Jesus Christ, before Muhammad, before these, male gods.
Propaganda.
There was the mother goddess. Every society had not a god, but a goddess, a mother goddess. The goddess of fertility, but also the goddess of prosperity, that bestowed riches through the fertility of the land. And so, the earliest societies really praised and revered women. And women were intimately involved, not just in supplying the next generation, but in farming the land, working the land, and in decision making within their communities. So what went wrong from there? How did sexism develop out of that relative state of equality? So I think, let me say that a lot of this is going to hang on paternity uncertainty. So this is a kind of biological fact. When a woman gives birth to a child, she knows that child is her own. So a child emerges from a woman's body. A mother knows that her baby is her own. But a father might always have a nagging doubt about whether their child really is their own. Now, this paternity uncertainty becomes, particularly a problem in societies where you have ownership and the creation of wealth, because with ownership and the creation of wealth comes the possibility of inheritance, of passing on what you create and what you save to the next generation. And you want to, as a parent, pass that on to your children.
Your rightful heir.
Your rightful heir. Now, that's fine for women because we know who our children are. But if you're a man and you have this niggling doubt about whether your children are truly your own, then that could, become quite stressful for you.
And this is also why many psychologists believe that they think it's easier for men to detach.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because there is, there's no guarantee that the child is theirs, whereas the mother is 100% invested in it. So I think, you ask any kind of sociobiologist, what's at the root of sexism, then really it's that paternity uncertainty that, particularly once you have ownership and wealth in a society, encourages men to want to isolate their wives from the rest of society, so to literally put their wife in a box, away from other men within society so that they can guarantee that they're not being impregnated by other men. And so I think this, drives practices, whether it is, seclusion of women, whether it's veiling of women, whether it's quite horrendous things like female genital mutilation, preventing your daughter from having sex with anyone other than the person that you determine is to be her husband. So I think it's that combination, really, of, the development of, ownership and wealth by itself isn't enough. It is that interacting with paternity uncertainty that starts to push societies in that direction. And I think particularly where land and, assets, so land was historically, the most important asset, fields and...
Still very important.
It is, isn't it? I mean, you look at the prices of land, the prices of, housing, homes. And
a pack of Lurpak,
Yeah. So particularly, in societies where land ended up in the hands of men, rather than shared equally between men and women. And, why in some societies did that happen more than others? Probably because of the first big technological revolution in farming, which began, we're talking, 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and that was the plough. The plough, initially relatively basic versions. So you imagine, a piece of metal or even wood attached to a long wooden stick, and that you could attach to an animal to drag along the land that then turned the land for you, saved on a lot of labour effort. So you don't have to get on your hands and knees and kind of dig into the land and turn the land and so on. So the plough, a big technological revolution in farming, meant that land could be, turned and so farmed more quickly. And that...
I guess it just exposed this paternity issue.
So I think what it did was it required a lot more muscle power. So if you've got this big wooden contraption, attached to a big, heavy, bull or some kind of cattle or animal, then working with that, managing that requires a degree of muscle power. Whereas the kinds of farming before then were much more, you get on your hands and knees and, with a little digging stick or a hoe, and men and women kind of did that equally.
Accessible to all.
Accessible to all. Whereas with the plough, that lent itself to muscle power. Yeah. And, I expect if I got out in the field with a plough, I probably wouldn't have much success.
But even I think that requires probably like the strongest of men, who take up those jobs.
It does, and you're right. So actually this is favouring, not just men, but a particular kind of category of men.
Ain't no waif getting out to plough the field. You know what? Like, no offence, waifs, we love you, but my family actually come from a farming background, and it is true that even though like a lot of the farming culture has kind of declined, the people who still are building the piggeries or working within farming, they're not thin, wafer thin, unstrong or unfit men. They're strong, and they're it demands a certain broad, and it demands a certain kind of rigor.
Yeah, roll up your sleeves and get in there. So and so interestingly, what historians find is that societies that have been using the plough for the longest amount of time actually are more sexist today.
So the plough equates to sexism.
So we could think of it as a technological revolution that advantaged men or muscle, over women, or, muscle over the brain, brawn over brain.
Chooses to see the muscle as the power.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So I think most people, well, I say that, but a lot of people would be quite happy moving to a dynamic that's more egalitarian when we look at sexism and kind of eradicating sexism. But as you said, this paternity issue that has stemmed through agricultural and farming and whatever, this paternity issue, are we always going to have to contend with that?
So, well, I would say in the modern day, two things. One, paternity testing. Which in a sense removes any degree of uncertainty, but for a father to request paternity testing is really it's a bit of a black mark against him, isn't it? Because it suggests a lack of trust in their partner, in the faithfulness of their partner. So I would say another thing, and that is that in a world where we get to choose our partners, we can be much more trusting of them. Whereas, historically, in large parts of the world, people didn't get to choose their partners. And if you don't choose your partner, perhaps your partner doesn't view you as desirable and, might fancy someone else instead. And so the risk is somewhat greater. So the best way as a man that you can lower the risk of, your child not being your own is to be in a world where women are free to make their own decisions about relationships, about marriage, about fertility. That's the best guarantee.
So the idea that they want to be with you rather than have to be with you, which
that's right.
I think that's what a lot of this noise is today about. Also, when I find my true love, even if, I've not been doing anything too crazy, I'm just going to say, just to settle your mind, we're going to do a paternity test, just so we don't get any weird energy creeping up or slight bits of sexism in the relationship. Another good topic in the book, but it's also kind of infuriating, is that how much throughout history women have been gaslighted into being this role of trad wife, staying at home, rearing the kids and looking after the household, which is a job in itself. We're not discrediting that. But the way it's being portrayed to women is that throughout history, that is the only job for you. You can't do much outside of that. Another interesting thing I saw alongside that, to contrast that you said in a different seminar, I want to say, is that a few years ago in 2018, there was some really interesting archaeological discoveries solidified that idea we have actually contradicts a lot of what the science dictates around who was staying at home and who was going out hunting. So I don't know if you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so 2018, and I'm going to take you high up on the hills of Peru. So we're in South America, high up on the hills of Peru. Archaeological dig underway. And there was this discovery of a body. Thousands of years old, this body. It was buried with a 24-piece hunting toolkit, including a number of sharpened, bits of stone of a kind you could attach to a stick and then throw at a wild animal. And when this body was discovered, there was a lot of excitement. Okay, we've uncovered the burial of a prize hunter from the Stone Age Americas. And the assumption was it was a man. Because do you know, in archaeology, the assumption has always been if you find a body buried with hunting tools or with weapons, that it must be male. So, testing the bones, looking for DNA and seeing, is it male or female? It really wasn't done because the presumption was it must be male, because if it was a hunter, if it was a fighter, then surely it was a man. So what happened in 2018 was there was an insistence that this skeleton should be scientifically tested because we shouldn't be making this assumption. And actually the test came back that this was a female.
Wow.
Now, she became known by, the local people in Peru that lived in that surrounding area. So local people there today, you ask her about this prize hunter from the Stone Age. They call her Wara Wara, and that translates as star. And they call her star, I think, because of all the press attention that came to Peru in 2018. And I think that press attention is indicative of the fact that, as you say, people were literally spitting out their cups of tea as they were drinking them and reading the newspaper headlines of the discovery of this female prize hunter from the Stone Age.
But it sounds like something that is uncommon, but I think if you dug up more archaeology sites, you would find that it's not that uncommon.
So you're right. So since what's happened is archaeologists have gone back and looked at all of the skeletons of these, big game hunters from the Stone Age Americas that have been found over the years. And through scientific testing, they've now shown that 40%, 4 in 10, were in fact female.
Wow. I think as well, like, people always equate women to being small and fragile. And of course, like, a man always will have the upper hand when it comes to physical strength. It's a reality. There are women who, have incredible physical capacity to go out hunting, as we said back then. Yeah, that's right. And certainly if you're, say, throwing a projectile, these kinds of hunting technologies, and droving animals as well. So actually, it's not just the person that is throwing the spear equivalent, it's people who are droving and spotting and trying to, get the animals in the right place so someone can then throw the spear, Or there's a lot of work to be done, and there's no reason why women can't be doing, as much of that work as men. Athleticism does not belong to one gender.
No, it doesn't, and it requires a lot of kind of skill and thought, mental skill and thought as well.
Gameplay,
definitely gameplay.
And I'm sorry, but women usually do play a better mental game than men. They do. I think when it comes to, like, even if you look at things like cheating, like, women often are more smart at cheating than men. So when it comes to gameplay, I think women, not all the time, but probably more often than not, take the cake on that one.
Perhaps take the leading role in that strategizing.
Yeah. I mean, they have to, like, if they've been groomed into this position of always being like the stay-at-home person, they're going to have more capacity to organise a family and whatnot. So even if they've been pushed into that way, I guess it lets up for more capacity to organise and...
Well, I mean, here's another interesting thing. Again, thinking about these early societies and discoveries. So not only has hunting traditionally been seen as largely male, and we're saying here that that's wrong, we're challenging that, but also, the birth of farming. So, implicitly or otherwise, I think there is an assumption that, the first fields were farmed by men. But again, if we look at the evidence that skeletons have to offer, one of the things that we find from, skeletons, say in Syria, where there were some of the first farms in human history, is that there is evidence of, joint damage and things on the female skeletons that just indicates how actively involved women were in, for example, milling grain that came off the first that was grown in the first farm. So, it's another way in which women were actively involved in food production, in supplying the economic needs of their families and their communities. And grinding grain was something that, to feed a family of 5 or 6, you could be grinding grain for 3 hours a day. So grinding the grain into flour, so then you can cook it, make bread to feed your family. And as I say, really, it's the joints of female skeletons that we see that on. So I think, whether it's hunting, whether it is being involved in farming and the production of food in other ways, I think women were always really, actively involved.
Hearing you speak is interesting because there's 2 genders for a reason, because when we come together, we create something really beautiful, which is life, another person, another child in the world, another opportunity to have like another soul in the world. And it kind of makes me think we were always meant to just walk side by side as friends, but there's something very like sinister of how that's just not a reality. And, men responsible for that probably. But
so perhaps whether men see women as competition or not, do you think?
But I don't understand how a man, I know that men see women as competition, but I don't understand how a man can, if he can physically decimate her. I don't understand what the real, hatred or, idea of it is, because you can just physically hurt them.
So here is the thing. Throughout history, women have been captured and controlled, sadly, by men. And, what drives that is the fact that women are valuable. We are valuable. We are powerful. What we can do with our bodies and with our brains is immense. Yeah. And you do not want to capture and control something that is of 0 value. You only want to capture and control something that has this value. But once you've captured and controlled it, you want that woman to feel that she has no value.
So it's easier.
You want to deny the value, devalue what she is doing, devalue what she is producing, devalue all the work that she is doing for the family business or whatever else. So I think actually at the root of sexism and the treatment of women is we're valuable.
Do you think also part of it, and I'm speaking very broadly as well, is that we by default control the sexual marketplace?
So
without no woman, there's no outlet, there's no opportunity to have a child as well with a man. But
I think I begin the book by saying that women are quite literally the origin of the world.
Yeah.
But I think it's very easy from that to try and pigeonhole women simply into a reproductive and a sexual role. And what I try to do with the book is to show actually that view of the past. I mean, you mentioned that actually there is a kind of popular perception that throughout most of history, women have been housewives, until, say, the 2 world wars of the 20th century, when apparently women started for the first time doing men's work. There is this view that, for all the thousands of years before then, women were housewives, that our role was reproductive and sexual, and that was about it. And as you say in Economica, what I show is no, we were hunting alongside men in the Stone Age. We were working the land alongside men until the plough blew us, pushed us in another direction. But, then on from that, what were we doing instead of ploughing the land? We were producing cloth, within the home. And cloth formed the first currency of international trade. Cloth was money before money even existed. Cloth was what was used to buy and sell, all other types of, goods and products within the economy. Women were helping build pyramids alongside men in ancient Egypt. They were helping to plumb the ancient city of Rome. I mean, in the book, I talk about how in ancient Rome, there were 4 times as many female plumbers as there are in Britain today. We were in medieval London. We were brewing beer, so 40% of brewers.
This is actually what I wanted to get onto, because I think it's actually quite a fun thing for the audience to hear. We were brewing beers, we were building pyramids, we were carving tools many, many eras ago, if we go to the Stone era, alongside our male counterparts. What other cool things have women been doing throughout history that we like to forget or wipe out?
So,
like a little list.
Where do where do I start? So, 19th century. So in the 19th century, there probably are people there who say, hang on a moment, I know that women weren't just working in the 20th century, doing jobs. They were also working in the 19th century in cotton mills, at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. But did you know that in addition to spinning and weaving cloth in cotton mills, we were also mining coal?
Really?
That is right. So in the early 19th century, in Wales and in Scotland,
where a lot of coal is produced.
Where a lot of coal was historically produced. So say in the Midlothians in Scotland, in Pembrokeshire, in Wales, between about a quarter and a third of the mining workforce, the adult mining workforce, was female. So women...
Can you say that percentage again?
So between about a quarter and a third of the adult mining workforce were female.
Why is that never spoken about?
Again, not only do we look at the past and we assume men were the hunters, men were the warriors, we also assume men were the miners, don't we? And to give you another example, in the 16th century, when Europeans, were colonizing South America and were really, taking silver out of the silver mines, bringing it back to Europe, and then, spending it, going on a spending spree with all this silver and buying in all the exotic produce of the Far East. Who was mining that silver? In those silver mines, it was women as well as men. So mining is one example. And to give you another example, a myriad of examples. So in the British Museum, there is a collection of historic business cards. And these are the business cards from across London in the 18th century. So think of Bridgerton, think of Jane Austen. These are the days when we imagine women in bonnets, parading through parks and so on. Women were doing much more than that, because we see in this collection of business cards, we find the business cards of female shoemakers, female toy makers, female fan makers, female cabinet makers, female tea sellers, female printers. So we find female entrepreneurs doing all the kinds of things in business that men were also doing. So I've tried to fill the book with examples from across time and across the world, showing that there is nothing that women cannot do.
I think also people who drive culture, I might butcher this, but if you go back to the Bronte sisters, the authors of that time, like the top percentile were female.
That's right, yes. So 10 of the 12 top selling, novelists in the late 18th, early 19th century were women. And you think about the novel. I mean, the novel, writing, publishing, that was the creative industry of the 18th century. I mean, this was, a time when the creative sector was really getting going. I mean, we think of creative industries as being a modern day invention, but no, they existed in the 18th century. I mean, and women were the pioneers.
They've existed as long as a fireplace has been for people to tell stories.
That is true.
And it's naive.
That is true.
It's naive to think that the only person who can tell an interesting story is a man.
Yeah. I'm sure all of our grandmas have a lot of interesting stories to tell.
I'm actually thinking about my grandma a lot as I speak to you, because it's just so interesting, like the different generations of trials and tribulations each gender has to go through. But I also feel incredibly privileged that I get to go through the best version so far.
Would you rather be a woman today than a woman in your grandmother's generation or your great grandmother's generation? What's your view, Heidi?
Today, of course.
Today,
I don't know how the answer could be anything different. Of course, today.
No, I would agree.
Would you? You would agree?
I would agree. I would much rather be a woman in Britain today than than virtually anywhere else, or any other period of history. I mean, it doesn't mean things are perfect. They're certainly not. But at the same time, I do think we often have too negative a view of the past. I think, when you look at the past, the pendulum has swung between times when things were improving for women and then times when they moved backwards. And I think actually the Victorian period was a period when things started to move backwards for women. And that was really when the ideal of the housewife was born. And then really what's happened...
Or commodified.
Commodified, yeah. And in part, what happened in the 19th century, I mean, we've already talked about how women were there in cotton mills producing cloth.
With babies and baskets.
Yeah, perhaps, older, more retired members of the family doing the childcare for all of the, younger generations of women. So systems of family care. So women were out there in the economy. But then what happened was there was a combination really of trade unions and, in terms of, professional work, professional societies like accountancies, societies for accountants and societies for medics and things like that started to push women out of the workplace in order to
extract for themselves.
Yeah. So as to create to mean that men going for those kinds of jobs didn't have to compete with women. Yeah. So you halve the competition in the labour market by pushing women out of the workplace. And that was what was going on in the 19th century.
And then you're ruled by a bunch of cowards.
Yeah, true.
It's true.
Well, so what happened then was women were really locked out of the most lucrative kinds of, paid work, whether that was in things like accountancy and medicine, or whether it was, like the higher end of cloth making in factories. And so women were left with either, being dependent on, their fathers and husbands, or if they needed to make a living, which most women realistically did, they were left with the lower paid work, work that was, that escaped unionization, work that was more informal, that was also often more risky with some of the worst working conditions,
like
domestic service, for example. Where, in terms of exposure to potential, situations of abuse, physical, sexual abuse, very long working hours, very limited freedom. So things like that. Or with a basket out, on the streets of the City of London, outside the big banking houses, outside the Bank of England, selling hot buns, to passing financiers and merchants and bankers.
It's just enough to keep you there, but not enough to lift you out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like, I'm going to use a very strong word, but that's the textbook of an abuser, to just keep you wanting a little bit more, but not give you enough so you can go and do. So
you are right that, Heidi, when it comes to abuse, economic abuse comes hand in hand with physical abuse. And I think certainly, the strategy of men who abuse women is to isolate them in an economic sense. You know, so to deny women of the opportunity to work, to try and leave women economically dependent on them as the abuser, so that they have no escape.
When you look at the rise of the trad wife movement, which I actually think is getting poked a lot of holes in at the moment, which is helpful, do you find it infuriating to the women who are really gleaning and falling for that? Because at the end of the day, I think it's incredibly lazy to say, oh, I want to be a trad wife. I think what they're actually saying in the modern day is, actually, I want to remove myself from all responsibility and I just want to go and do the super curated, stylized version of being a homemaker. And, you know, being a homemaker is hard, but they're just kind of withdrawing from the responsibility of the fight. Does it annoy you?
So I honestly think that as a woman, you cannot be free unless you have your own economic independence. Unless you have money in your own pocket, you cannot be free. You cannot be happy. You cannot make a good life for yourself. Now, let me, you know, give you a historic example of this. Why did the West become rich? You know, how did the West, led by Britain and the Industrial Revolution, you know, how did the West overtake parts of the world that had been, you know, at the top of the economic league tables for centuries? You know, so we're talking, you know, historically, going back thousands of years, the richest parts of the world were not Europe, were not North America, you know, it wasn't the West, it was China, it was India, it was the Middle East. So how did the West not just catch up, but overtake? Now, I think the biggest difference was in women's lives, and not in the lives of elite women, but in the lives of ordinary women. So in China, the Middle East and India, the average woman would be married off while she was a young teenager to someone who was of her father's choosing. And she would then be absorbed into her parents-in-law's home. Now, very often within her parents-in-law's home, she's doing something economically really valuable for you know, her parents-in-law's family. So, for example, in China, your daughters-in-law would be producing cloth, you know, cotton cloth or silk, which the family would then take to market and, you know, sell for a handsome price. But you as the daughter-in-law, you didn't get the value from that.
You're not being cut in on the deal.
You're not cut in on the deal.
No.
And this led to, you know, extreme mistreatment of women within families, despite the fact that they were valuable, creating value. You know, creating value isn't enough to guarantee good treatment for yourself. You know, unless you have access to that value that you're creating, that cannot guarantee fair treatment. Now, what was different in Europe? So in Europe, it was normal for young women in their teens to go out and get a job, you know, to venture beyond their own family home, to go out and get a job. And for them to be able to keep the earnings that they made from that work. And that little bit of financial independence freed them from child marriage, what is effectively child marriage. Because you could run off and get a job and support yourself, you could escape child marriage. You know, you could run off and build a better life.
And how mature to actually realise that at that age.
At that age.
Yeah.
So that ability for young women to access the labour market and get jobs, even if they're quite, you know, low paid, basic jobs, was so important. And what that meant was women could take charge of the marriage decision for themselves. They could decide for themselves whether, when and who to marry. And what we know, and we know this from all of the marriage records, you know, from hundreds of churches across the UK. You know, you look at those marriage records from the 1600s, 1700s, you can see the average age that a woman was getting married in Britain at that time was about 25. It wasn't 14 or 15 as it was in China, India, the Middle East. It was 25. And also, a whole chunk of women didn't get married at all. Supported themselves independently without a husband.
But the jealousy that creates in men creates the name of spinster.
True. No, that is right. That is right. So, it was, yeah.
How dare you leave this system that benefits me? How dare you go and do your own thing without me or feed into my power system or chain?
So here's the thing, that actually this independence that women had wasn't just good for women, it was good for men. It was good for society as a whole. Because what I argue in Economica is that independence for ordinary women sowed the seeds of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. Because, what it meant was the fact that women were getting married later in life and fewer of them were getting married meant that we weren't in a world where from puberty girls were producing one child after another, 1 year after another, creating this immense population pressure and erosion of the natural environment and depletion of resources, and so on. So actually, we avoided that type of crisis that began to develop, say, in China, historically. Also because women were getting married in their mid-20s as opposed to their teens, and the smaller families that result from that, the average family could better afford to educate, skill up the children that they did have, so pay for an apprenticeship, for example, and they could better afford to save. And so that helped to provide funds for, say, the family business or to invest in the economy. So actually this, independence that young women historically had to a much greater degree in the West compared with China, India, and the Middle East created much better circumstances for the economy to flourish, less population pressure, more skills, more saving, in a way that was going to help everyone, not just women.
Yeah, I mean, so true, everything you just said. I'm going to take it in a different direction. Yeah. I don't know, did you watch the Louis Theroux documentary?
I did,
okay.
Yes.
I thought it was so interesting watching it. It wasn't telling me anything new, but I think it's a good introduction to someone who isn't maybe aware of what the manosphere is. And the ginger guy, I think he's called Justin in the documentary.
Is he the one from Miami?
Yeah, he's cowboy-esque. But anyway, he takes Louis to the roof and he invites Louis to look at the whole landscape of Miami. And he says to Louis, "Tell me a woman who's built anything you see." Well, first of all, his mum shoved him out of her vagina. So that's one. And then he uses the internet, which, was founded by a whole, ironically, network of people, but a lot of females.
Lots of female computer pioneers.
Exactly, including Radia Perlman. And the very thing that he makes his money on is created by a woman. Yeah. The cheek, the gall, the nerve.
Well, this is why I think history can be our greatest ammunition. Yeah. Because there is this perception within the manosphere that the reason the West became this great modern day civilization was on the back of men. Male scientists, male engineers, male inventors. And I argue in the book, no, men were not enough. And actually, we've just talked about how, actually, in indirect ways, the way in which the freedoms of ordinary women were providing, that context for a flourishing economy. An environment with lower population pressure, higher saving, higher skills that helped us all. But also women, directly as well as you say, as inventors, as computer pioneers. We've talked about women as miners as well as women in factories and so on. So, there are lots of examples, but I think unless we talk about and champion those examples, this idea that Western civilization was created on the back of men's efforts alone,
they'd
will
like to
continue to dominate.
Yeah.
And, if you believe that, and so with it, if you believe that women's paid work is just a recent phenomenon, then perhaps you can understand why you would think it's just a flash in the pan. You know, it's not the normal way of doing things, that it's anti-human evolution, that actually we should be trying to get back to how things always were. But if we can show, actually, no, the way things always were was women helping to build the most successful civilizations in human history.
Well, you only know what you know, so you can't be angry at someone who doesn't know better. But the trad wife thing that I kind of asked if you get angry about it, I can get angry at that person because they should know better, because they live in such a privileged time to be a woman. The sense of control that we've spoken about, that, you know, is managed to influence through patriarchy and sexism. I'm not particularly religious. I don't know about yourself.
No, not particularly. No.
Okay. But the fear and the control is almost as a religion would act, or almost as this great Wizard of Oz control. But actually, once you realise that it's not someone all-knowing, all-powerful, and you just see, I'm going to be very vulgar, but like this pathetic little small man behind controlling thoughts rather than being the thing that he's trying to allude that he is, you just realise, oh my God, you're pathetic.
The hypocrisy.
They're so desperate to create this illusion of power rather than focusing on what power is.
They are. And also the way in which they will, you know, for example, take a cut on, glamour models, sex workers, through promoting them on their channels. But then behind the scenes will be really, denigrating these women.
Or like on the Louis Theroux documentary.
Yeah. And saying, they wouldn't want their daughters to do that, wouldn't want their wives to do that, whilst taking a cut from, women that are, monetizing all their assets, their brains as well as their bodies.
I mean, full transparency. The reason I started this podcast is because I was an exotic dancer.
Yeah.
I come from kind of a privileged angle where that lets me elevate and kind of just use like a market that was out there already, and I felt safe and comfortable in it to extrapolate, take on and move on. But we're getting into the whole Madonna whore complex, which could honestly be its own separate podcast episode, which I don't think we have time for, but we'll
save that for another time.
We'll save it for the second book. Well, the fourth book that the fifth book that comes out. One thing that I did want to kind of touch on as well is the link between the Greek society and the Roman society, which I found really interesting reading the book, in that when you look at the Greeks, when they were building their society, women weren't really cut into the dialogue of that, and they're kind of remembered and revered for their politics, but not so much their economics.
That's right.
But when you contrast that with the Roman society, there was a point where women were cut into that conversation and things were thriving, but when they were taken out, again, things kind of demised. So to zoom out of what I've just said there, what I want to ask you as a historian, as an economist, we're seeing a similar parallel today, aren't we? We're seeing the parallel of, things have been going well. Women have been feeding more into education, having more autonomy. But now I think men are panicking. Birth rate declines, or, the idea that women are choosing whether they want to be with them, not having to want to be with them.
Choosing to be independent rather than married.
Are you concerned with the fate that we might follow, that the Romans did, if we don't switch up and change up?
Oh, I absolutely am. I mean, we are on a knife edge. So if there is one lesson that comes from Economica, it is that the most successful civilizations throughout history have always been those where women are at the heart of the economy. But the subsequent collapse of those civilizations is always preceded by a process of increasingly sidelining women, pushing them out of the formal economy and into this very limited role within the home. And, an example of that, perfect example of that, is the Romans. So why were the Romans so much more economically successful than the Athenians? You mentioned Aristotle earlier. I think it's because women in the Roman world were so much freer than they were in Athens. So they were, free to set up and run businesses. They were free to go out into the marketplace. They were free to uncover their hair. Whereas in Athens, to be a respectable woman, you had to stay secluded within the home and cover your hair. So that really limited your involvement in the wider economy. In Rome, women, they produced, wine and olive oil. They traded it across the Mediterranean. I mean, they were doing all kinds of wonderful things. I mean, Julia Felix, the property developer of Roman Pompeii. I mean, if you think Donald Trump was the property developer of New York, she was 2,000 years before him there building, Roman Pompeii.
Don't even speak to me about that man. Please don't.
But then what happened was that the Roman world started to get into an increasing kind of moral panic about what women were doing with their lives. So some within Roman society worried that women were spending too much time on paid work and not enough time breeding for the good of Rome. They worried about, falling marriage rates. Yeah. They worried about divorce. They worried about increasing immigration. So, of course, as the Roman Empire expands, you've got much more cosmopolitanism.
This is copy and paste to modern day.
It's copy and paste, yeah. There was an attack on women, an attack on immigration, a desire to reassert traditional Roman values, and a feeling that for that to happen, women needed to breed for the good of Rome. And, did that help?
No.
The Roman economy, of course, famously
toppled.
Collapsed.
Yeah,
collapsed. And so if we, in terms of Western civilization, if we do what the manosphere wants, we're going to go and end up going in the direction of the Roman Empire. We'll go from rise to collapse.
Well, I do want to move this on to a more positive note, because I have something that might give people more hope if they're wondering what's going to happen if we're toppling on the edge of talks about manosphere, trad wives, reverting back to traditional values. So something that has been bubbling up in economic news, and I wonder why you don't see it across mainstream news. Okay. Interesting. Is that there is something that is going to happen over the next few decades called the Great Wealth Transfer. I guess you've heard of it. Yeah. I mean, I'd be shocked if you hadn't. And it's quite exciting, ladies. Currently, women are on the verge of controlling allegedly 70% of global wealth, with an eye-watering transfer of 60 trillion to be parlayed to them over the next coming years, specifically the next two generations. According to JP Morgan, what has been coined as the Great Wealth Transfer is an inevitable as women continue to outlive spouses, earn more and inherit, thus taking over for economic helm. Thoughts, feelings, and what are your predictions as that happens? Because this is going to hit society like a tsunami wave.
So at the moment, the majority of wealth across the world is in the hands of men, and women are the minority holders of wealth. But over the course of the next 2 decades, actually that's going to rebalance. And we're going to move much closer to equality in terms of, distribution of wealth between men and women. Possibly, who knows, we might tip over into women holding a larger share of wealth than men. Who knows?
I guess it depends how many baby girls are born and baby boys are born.
So I would say that there are 3 or 4 things pushing in this direction. So one is, the boomer generation has accumulated a large amount of wealth, including in the form of property. You think of what's happened to the value of properties.
Yeah, the wealth hoarding.
Yeah, that's right. And at some point, none of us is getting any younger.
But we love you boomers.
So, but also bear in mind, women, the wives, tend to outlive their husbands. Mm-hmm. So what will happen is that boomer generation wealth will move into the hands of widows, but also not just sons, but daughters as well.
Because they're allowed.
Because, yeah, that's right. So that's the first factor. The next factor is that, within married couples, I say historically, in the last, few decades, men have typically made the big financial decisions. Whereas increasingly men and women are sharing those big financial decisions. Women are much more involved in having their names on title deeds and things like that.
More equity into their life.
Yeah, that's right. Much more equal within married couples. Another thing that's happening is, women are much more likely to be in higher paid jobs now than they were, say, 50 or 60 years ago. So women becoming independently wealthy, and, some women choosing not to marry. And so,
they're not sharing their wealth.
Sharing their wealth with a male spouse.
I guess they're sharing it through tax, but they're not sharing it directly with a male heir or a spouse. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, all of these forces are pushing in the direction of women being, in charge, having their hands on more assets within the economy than has been the case for a very long time.
I'm interested to know what you would predict as this wealth gets transferred into our hands of where the money will go. Women are historically known to prioritize ESG policy, so environmental, social, and governance. So fundamentally, as this wealth transfers, will society start trickling in to look more fair, more different?
So I think what's interesting is wealth managers, so the people who kind of look after people's investment portfolios, are increasingly opening their eyes to this shift. And, traditionally the wealth management industry, most wealth managers have been men, and most
Mine's
of their
female.
clients. Okay, great. Yeah. And their clients, large. And even when they're advising married couples, typically it's the man that has been most involved in the discussions and the relationship and so on. So what's happening now is that wealth managers are in a position where they're going to have to nurture relationships with female clients. And those female clients might not be too happy if all the people looking after their money are men, and might have questions about that. So certainly what's going to happen going forward is that ultimately women will vote with their feet when it comes to, how their wealth is being managed, how it's being invested. Women will vote with their feet. And, that could create quite a lot of churn in terms of the wealth management industry, quite a lot of churn in terms of, what investments attract.
What do you specifically, mean by feet?
Vote with our feet. So if, for example, you are inheriting money from that boomer generation, and that wealth manager has built up a great relationship with your dad or your husband, but not with you, then perhaps you might jump ship and find someone else to
give the business to.
To give the business to.
Okay.
Yeah. Just one example.
Yeah.
Now I do though feel that in some ways this whole bit of a panic really within the wealth management industry about oh dear, we're used to dealing with men and now we're going to have to deal with women, and how do we work with this? I think perhaps people are over panicking because there's a lot of casual sexism that creeps into this, and ultimately I think men and women, we have more in common than we have that divides us. So I think we're not a completely different species when it comes to our tastes when it comes to wealth and investing and so on.
No, we're just a bit hormonally different and physically. That's it.
So here's the thing. You look at the research and there are those that claim that women are worse investors than men and those that claim women are better investors than men. And, I think the reality is we can, men and women can be equally good investors. And it's just about us being, financially educated and accepting that we can all, men and women, be both rational and emotional. And, when it comes to financial decision making, we need to be aware of our emotions, but we need to be well informed so that we can be rational as well.
We also need to be but we also need to teach like our daughters and like younger women's society not to be naive that people will be jealous of like the wealth that is coming in. It's just inevitable. Like we feel the jealousy right now, and I think that is in correlation with the manosphere like grieving the loss of their entitlement.
I know. I mean, you look at the first female tycoon in the US, a wonderful woman called Hetty Green, Victorian matronly figure of the US. What was she called? The Witch of Wall Street.
Now you can laugh off if that name happened now. You could be like, oh my God, thank you. Like when someone calls you a bitch, like if I've not been called a bitch by a man, I've not done anything right in my life. But back then, obviously I can see it's a very unattractive name. But if there's one thing I've gathered from our conversation today, Victoria, is that when people say, feminism, it doesn't matter, even that word's been bastardized. People don't like using it anymore because it's been pumped up to mean something completely different from what it actually is. It does matter. Like the exact reason of why people don't want you to feel comfortable saying feminism or equality is to keep you off the track of where it's probably more beneficial to go. And thank you so much for giving like context and examples and tangible pieces of information that people can actually listen to, hear and act practically upon.
Always trust in the money in your own pocket. I think the worst thing that we can do as women is to find ourselves financially dependent on men.
Let's get comfortable with money being the bottom line.
Yeah, that's it.
So the book is Economica. You can find it at
every good bookshop. You can find it online. You can find it on audiobooks. The hardback is out now. The paperback is coming in July, and there are 7 foreign translations coming this year, and more to follow. And so
you can listen to it as well on Spotify. Thank you so much.
A pleasure, Heidi.